Sometimes a man thinks he's done saving people, especially when the world has taken everything he ever loved. But deep in the frozen mountains of the late 1800s, Jonas Whitmore discovers that some encounters change everything. He's riding to his cabin when Catherine, a desperate 25-year-old woman, stumbles from the woods. She's beaten, starving, and begging him to take her with him. Jonas has spent years avoiding people and their problems, but something in her eyes reminds him of feelings he thought were buried forever. As they journey through the harsh wilderness, he realizes that helping her might be the key to healing his own broken heart. What secret is Catherine hiding that could destroy them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carved through the towering pines like a blade, carrying with it the promise of a storm that would bury these mountains in snow for days. Jonas Whitmore pulled his wool coat tighter around his weathered frame and urged his horse forward along the narrow trail that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat over the past 15 years. At 53, he moved with the careful precision of a man who had learned that survival in these mountains demanded respect for every detail: the angle of the clouds, the behavior of his horse's ears, the subtle changes in the wind's voice through the trees. Ranger, his bay gelding, snorted and shook his massive head, sending puffs of vapor into the frigid air. The horse had been Jonas's companion for 8 years now, and together they had navigated countless storms, treacherous passes, and the kind of solitude that could drive lesser men to madness. Jonas reached forward and patted the animal's neck, feeling the familiar comfort of warm muscle beneath his gloved hand. "I know, old friend," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "Storm's coming hard. We'll be home soon enough. Home." The word still felt strange in his mouth after all these years. The cabin he had built with his own hands wasn't really a home. It was a refuge, a place to exist between the ghosts of his past and the uncertainty of whatever future remained to him. But it was shelter, and in this wilderness, shelter meant the difference between life and death. Jonas had not always been a mountain man. Once he had been Lieutenant Jonas Whitmore of the Union Army, a decorated officer who had led men through some of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. He had been a husband to Sarah, a father to little Mary, a man with plans and dreams and a belief that the world could be made better through courage and conviction. That man had died somewhere in the smoke and thunder of Gettysburg, though his body had stubbornly continued breathing for years afterward. The leather Bible in his saddlebag shifted with Ranger's movement, its worn pages containing the promises of a God he had once trusted implicitly. Jonas had carried that Bible through every battle, had read from it to dying soldiers, had clung to its words when the darkness threatened to swallow him whole. Now it remained with him more from habit than faith, a remnant of the man he used to be. The trail wound upward through stands of towering evergreens, their branches heavy with snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the pale afternoon light. Jonas knew every twist and turn of this path, could navigate it blindfolded if necessary. In 2 miles, he would reach the clearing where his cabin stood, its stone chimney already prepared with kindling and firewood for the storm ahead. He would tend to Ranger in the small barn he had built, prepare a simple meal, and settle in to wait out whatever fury nature chose to unleash. It was a predictable existence, and Jonas had grown to appreciate predictability. Surprises, in his experience, usually brought pain. The first snowflakes began to fall as they rounded a bend in the trail, fat and lazy at first, then increasing in number and intensity. Ranger's hooves crunched rhythmically in the gathering snow, and Jonas pulled his hat lower over his eyes. The storm was arriving ahead of schedule, but they would make it to the cabin before the worst of it hit. That was when he saw her. She stumbled from behind a massive pine tree like a ghost materializing from the wilderness itself. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around a face that was pale with cold and exhaustion, and her clothes, a traveling dress that had once been fine but now hung in tatters, clung to her slender frame. She moved with the desperate, unsteady gait of someone who had been walking far longer than her strength should have allowed. Ranger snorted and sidestepped, sensing Jonas's sudden tension. The woman looked up at them with eyes that were the color of winter sky, gray-blue and filled with a desperation so profound it hit Jonas like a physical blow. She raised one trembling hand toward them, and he could see that her fingers were red with cold. Her lips nearly blue. "Please," she whispered, and her voice carried clearly in the still air, despite its weakness. "Please don't leave me here." Jonas felt every instinct he had cultivated over 15 years of solitude screaming at him to keep riding. He had learned the hard way that getting involved in other people's problems led only to heartache and loss. The mountains had taught him that survival meant looking after yourself and trusting no one. People brought complications, and complications brought pain. But something in those gray-blue eyes held him frozen in his saddle. There was intelligence there, and courage fighting against despair, and a quality of refined desperation that spoke of education and breeding rather than common desperation. This was not some frontier woman accustomed to hardship. This was someone who had known comfort and safety until very recently. "Please," she said again, and this time she stepped closer to Ranger, her hand reaching out to grasp Jonas's stirrup. "Please take me with you. I won't be any trouble, I swear it. I can't go back." "I won't go back." The terror in her voice was real and immediate, and despite every wall he had built around his heart, Jonas felt something stir in response. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached her. Up close, he could see that her face bore the fading marks of violence, a yellowing bruise along her left cheekbone, a small cut at the corner of her mouth that was healing but still tender. "Ma'am," he said carefully, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "You're half frozen. What are you doing out here alone?" She looked up at him with those remarkable eyes, and he could see her fighting to maintain her composure despite the exhaustion and fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 25, with the kind of delicate beauty that belonged in parlors and drawing rooms, not in the harsh wilderness of the Colorado Rockies. "I'm running," she said simply, and the honesty in her voice cut through his defenses like a knife. "From someone who means to do me great harm. I've been walking for 3 days, and I don't think I can go much farther." Jonas studied her face, noting the determination that warred with the desperation in her expression. Whatever had driven her into these mountains, it was serious enough to risk death from exposure rather than face it. The storm was intensifying, and standing here much longer would put them all in danger. "Can you ride?" he asked. Relief flooded her features so completely that Jonas felt his chest tighten in response. "Yes," she said, "I can ride." He helped her onto Ranger's back, settling her behind his saddle with as much propriety as the circumstances allowed. She was light as a bird, and shivering violently despite her obvious efforts to control it. Jonas shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, ignoring her protests. "Name's Jonas Whitmore," he said as he remounted, settling himself carefully in front of her. "What should I call you?" "Catherine," she replied, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Catherine Morrison. The name meant nothing to him, but he filed it away nonetheless. As they resumed their journey toward the cabin, he could feel her gradually relaxing against his back, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline that had kept her moving. The storm continued to intensify around them, but Ranger pressed forward with the steady determination of a horse who knew exactly where home waited. Jonas found himself hyper-aware of the woman. Behind him, the way her breathing gradually slowed and deepened, the trust implicit in how she leaned against him for warmth and support, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair despite her ordeal. It had been so long since he had been in close contact with another human being that every sensation felt magnified, almost overwhelming. The cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a beacon of hope, its solid log walls and steep-pitched roof promising warmth and safety. Jonas had built it to withstand the worst that mountain weather could throw at it, and it had never failed him yet. As they approached, he could feel Catherine stirring behind him, perhaps sensing that they had reached their destination. "Is this your home?" she asked softly. Jonas helped her down from Ranger's back, noting how she swayed on her feet, despite her obvious efforts to appear strong. "It's where I live," he replied, which was not quite the same thing but would have to suffice for now. The interior of the cabin was sparse but comfortable, furnished with handmade furniture that spoke of skill and patience rather than abundance. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, while shelves lined with books and simple necessities occupied the others. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor all in one, with a small bedroom beyond and a loft accessible by a sturdy ladder. Jonas moved with practiced efficiency, lighting the fire he had prepared before leaving that morning and filling a kettle with water from the barrel by the door. Catherine stood in the center of the room, still wrapped in his coat, looking around with curious eyes that missed very little. "Sit," he said, indicating the chair nearest the fireplace. "You need to get warm before anything else." She obeyed without argument, sinking into the chair with a soft sigh of relief. As the fire began to catch and spread warmth through the room, Jonas could see color slowly returning to her cheeks. He busied himself with preparing a simple meal, acutely conscious of her presence, but unsure how to navigate this sudden intrusion into his carefully ordered solitude. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, rattling the windows and sending snow spiraling down the chimney to hiss against the flames. Jonas realized with a mixture of resignation and something that might have been relief that Catherine Morrison, whoever she was and whatever trouble she carried with her, would be staying for at least the next few days. As he worked, he found himself stealing glances at her, noting the way the firelight played across her features and brought out golden highlights in her dark hair. She was beautiful, there was no denying that, but it was a beauty tempered by intelligence and marked by recent suffering. Whatever had driven her into the wilderness, it had tested her in ways that few people her age should have to endure. The wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, but the solid walls held firm against its assault. Jonas had built this place to be a fortress against the world, and tonight it would shelter not just him but this mysterious woman who had appeared from the storm like an answer to a prayer he had never thought to offer. Time would tell whether that was a blessing or a curse. Catherine sat in silence, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the flames. She had said little since their arrival, but Jonas could sense the tension coiled within her like a spring wound too tight. Every unexpected sound, a log settling in the fire, the wind gusting particularly hard against the walls, made her flinch slightly, as if she expected danger to come crashing through the door at any moment. "You should eat," Jonas said quietly, setting a bowl of stew before her. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." She looked up at him with those remarkable grey-blue eyes, and he saw gratitude there mixed with something that might have been shame. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." "No need for repayment," Jonas replied, settling into the chair across from her with his own bowl. "Mountain law says you help folks in trouble. Weather like this kills people who aren't prepared for it." Catherine lifted the spoon to her lips with hands that still trembled slightly. Whether from cold or exhaustion or something else entirely, Jonas couldn't tell. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger as her body reminded her of its needs. He watched her covertly as he ate his own meal, noting the way she held herself with unconscious grace despite her ordeal, the careful way she moved that suggested recent injury. "Where were you headed?" he asked after they had eaten in companionable silence for several minutes. Catherine's spoon paused halfway to her mouth, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Anywhere but where I came from." Jonas nodded, understanding more than she might expect. He had once felt that same desperate need to escape, to put distance between himself and memories too painful to bear. "That's fair enough," he said. "Sometimes anywhere else is the only destination that matters." The simple acceptance in his voice seemed to touch something in her, and her composure cracked just slightly. "I'm not what you might think," she said carefully. "I'm not some saloon girl or camp follower. I am a married woman, or was until 3 days ago." Jonas felt something cold settle in his stomach at the way she said it, at the fear that flickered across her features like shadow. "Was your husband the one who gave you those bruises?" Catherine's hand rose unconsciously to touch the fading mark on her cheekbone, and her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Among other things," she said quietly. The simple admission hit Jonas harder than he expected. He had seen enough violence in his time to recognize its aftermath, had held dying soldiers who bore wounds inflicted by their own countrymen. But there was something particularly cruel about violence visited upon someone so clearly defenseless, someone whose only crime had been trusting the wrong person. "You're safe here," he said, and the words carried the weight of a promise. Storm's not letting up any time soon, and even if it did, nobody's tracking anything in this weather. Catherine nodded, but he could see that she didn't entirely believe it. Fear had become her constant companion, and it would take more than words to convince her that she was truly beyond its reach. As the evening wore on, they settled into an uneasy routine. Jonas tended the fire and checked the windows, ensuring that the cabin remained secure against the storm's assault. Catherine helped clear away the dishes, moving carefully around the small space with the grace of someone accustomed to domestic tasks. There was an odd intimacy to their shared silence. Two people thrown together by circumstance, finding their way towards something that might eventually become trust. It was near midnight when the nightmares began. Jonas had given Catherine his bed, insisting that she needed proper rest more than he did. He had settled himself in the main room, wrapped in blankets before the dying fire, listening to the storm's gradual weakening and the unfamiliar sound of another person's breathing in his sanctuary. Sleep had come surprisingly easily, perhaps because some part of him felt more settled, knowing that he was not entirely alone in the world. He woke to the sound of sobbing. At first, he thought it might be the wind, which sometimes made sounds remarkably like human voices when it caught the cabin at certain angles. But as consciousness fully returned, he realized that the sounds were coming from the bedroom where Catherine slept. Soft, broken sobs interspersed with words he couldn't quite make out, all delivered in a voice thick with terror and despair. Jonas lay still for several minutes, torn between the desire to help and the knowledge that she might not welcome his intrusion into what was clearly a private hell. But when her cries became more urgent, more desperate, he could no longer remain passive. He rose quietly and approached the bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar. In the faint light that filtered in from the main room's banked fire, he could see Catherine thrashing restlessly in the bed, her face contorted with fear even in sleep. Her words became clearer as he drew closer, and what he heard made his blood run cold. "Please, Thaddeus, no more," she whispered brokenly. "I'll be good, I promise I'll be good. Please don't." The raw terror in her voice cut through Jonas like a blade. Without thinking, he pushed the door open and stepped into the room, his voice gentle but firm. "Catherine, Catherine, wake up. You're safe." Her eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused, and for a moment she stared at him as if he were a stranger, or worse, as if he were someone else entirely. Then awareness returned, and she pressed herself back against the headboard, her breathing rapid and shallow. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to." "Hush," Jonas said quietly, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "You have nothing to apologize for. Just a bad dream." Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, and in the dim light he could see that she was shaking. "They're not dreams," she whispered. "They're memories." The simple honesty of that statement hit Jonas with unexpected force. He had his own memories that visited him in the dark hours, his own ghosts that refused to stay buried. He understood the particular hell of reliving trauma in the vulnerable hours of sleep, when the mind's defenses were at their weakest. "Your husband," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Catherine nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Thaddeus Morrison. Judge Thaddeus Morrison." of the territorial court. Her voice carried a bitter edge now, tinged with anger that was healthier than the pure fear she had shown earlier. A respected man in the community, a pillar of justice and moral authority. Jonas felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. A judge would have connections, resources, the ability to track down a fleeing wife with methods that ordinary men could not employ. It explained the depth of her terror, the sense that nowhere would be truly safe for her. "What finally made you run?" he asked gently. Catherine was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, despite the tears that continued to fall. "He killed a man. In our home in front of me. A lawyer who had discovered some of Thaddeus's dealings with certain unsavory characters. When I saw what my husband was truly capable of, when I realized that I had evidence of his crimes, I knew that my life was forfeit if I stayed." She reached beneath her pillow and withdrew something that glinted gold in the firelight. A wedding ring, heavy and ornate, stained with what looked like dried blood. "I couldn't bear to wear it another moment," she said simply. "Not after what I witnessed." Jonas stared at the ring, understanding now the full magnitude of what Catherine had risked by fleeing. She wasn't just escaping an abusive marriage. She was running from a man who had demonstrated his willingness to kill to protect his secrets. A man with the resources and authority to hunt her down, no matter where she tried to hide. "You're brave," he said quietly. "Braver than most people would be in your situation." Catherine looked at him with surprise, as if the concept of her own courage had never occurred to her. "I was terrified," she said. "I still am." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Jonas replied, remembering words he had once spoken to young soldiers before battle. "It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear." Outside, the storm was finally beginning to weaken, but Jonas knew that their troubles were far from over. Catherine Morrison had brought more than just her own desperate flight to his mountain sanctuary. She had brought a reckoning that would test everything he thought. He knew about himself and the life he had chosen. As dawn approached, they sat together in the growing light, two wounded souls, finding unexpected solace in shared understanding. Neither spoke of what the clearing weather might bring, but both understood that their lives had become irrevocably intertwined, in ways that neither had sought, but both perhaps desperately needed. Morning came softly to the mountain cabin, filtered through clouds that still hung heavy with the promise of more snow. Jonas woke to unfamiliar sounds, the quiet rustling of someone moving carefully about the main room, the soft clink of pottery, the whisper of fabric against wood. For a moment, he lay still on his makeshift bed before the fireplace, disoriented by the presence of another person in his sanctuary. Catherine stood at the small kitchen area, her back to him as she worked over the stove. She had found his spare clothes, a woolen shirt that hung loose on her slender frame, and trousers that she had cinched with rope around her waist. Her dark hair was braided simply down her back, and there was something both vulnerable and determined in the set of her shoulders. "You don't need to," Jonas began as he sat up, but she turned with a gentle smile that stopped his protest. "I need to do something useful," she said quietly. "I've been helpless for so long that I had forgotten the satisfaction of simple tasks." She had prepared coffee and was working on what appeared to be breakfast from his limited supplies. Jonas watched her move with practiced efficiency, noting the careful way she favored her left side and the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of exhaustion not yet fully healed. "How are you feeling?" he asked, rising to tend the fire. "Better," Catherine replied, and he could hear genuine gratitude in her voice. "Your kindness has given me something I thought I had lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope." The simple word hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that transcended their brief acquaintance. Jonas felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he had thought buried so deeply that it could never resurface. As they shared breakfast in comfortable quiet, Jonas found himself studying Catherine's face in the morning light. The bruises were fading, but they had been replaced by something else, a wariness that went deeper than physical injury. a careful watchfulness that suggested she had learned to gauge danger in the smallest gestures and expressions. "Tell me about your husband," Jonas said gently. "Help me understand what we might be facing." Catherine's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips, and for a moment he thought she might retreat into the silence that had protected her through the night. But then she set the cup down and met his eyes with a steadiness that spoke of hard-won courage. "Thaddeus Morrison is not a man who accepts defeat," she said carefully. "He has built his entire life around control. Control over his courtroom, his community, his home. When I left, I didn't just escape an unhappy marriage. I declared war on his very sense of who he is." Jonas nodded, understanding the implications. Men like that didn't simply let go of what they considered their property, especially when that property possessed knowledge that could destroy them. "How long were you married to him?" 3 years, Catherine replied, and there was a lifetime of suffering compressed into those 2 words. "Long enough to learn that the charming gentleman who courted me existed only until the marriage contract was signed. After that," she stopped, her hand moving unconsciously to touch a faded scar at her temple that Jonas hadn't noticed before. The gesture spoke volumes about the nature of her marriage, about the gradual escalation of violence that had culminated in her desperate flight. "He has connections throughout the territory," she continued. "Business partners, political allies, men who owe him favors or fear his wrath. If he chooses to hunt me down, he won't lack for resources or willing hands." Jonas rose and moved to the window, peering out at the snow-covered landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by white silence, beautiful and deadly in equal measure, like so many things in these mountains. "Why did you come this way?" he asked. "Most folks fleeing would head for the railroad." "Try to get as far away as possible." Catherine joined him at the window, and he was acutely aware of her presence beside him, the warmth of her body, the faint scent of lavender that still clung to her hair despite everything she had endured. "Because I knew he would expect me to run toward civilization," she said softly. "Thaddeus has a low opinion of women's capabilities. He would never imagine that I might survive in the wilderness, much less choose it deliberately." There was pride in her voice, and Jonas found himself admiring the cunning that had led her to confound her pursuers' expectations. It took intelligence and courage to choose the harder path, especially when every instinct screamed for the safety of crowds and laws and civilization. "You know these mountains well," Catherine observed, changing the subject with the delicate skill of someone accustomed to navigating dangerous conversational waters. 15 years, Jonas replied. "Came here after the war, looking for someplace quiet enough to hear myself think." "The war?" Jonas was quiet for a long moment, memories stirring like embers in cold ash. He rarely spoke of those years, had trained himself to lock them away, where they couldn't touch the careful peace he had built in these mountains. But something in Catherine's presence made the words come easier than they had in years. "Lieutenant in the Union Army," he said finally. "Saw too much, lost too much. Came home to find that everything I'd been fighting to protect was gone." He moved away from the window, busying himself with checking the fire. But Catherine's gentle voice followed him. "Your family?" "Wife and daughter," Jonas replied, his voice carefully level. "Influenza took them while I was away. Came home to find graves, instead of the homecoming I'd been dreaming about for 2 years. Catherine was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of shared understanding. "I'm sorry. That kind of loss, it changes everything, doesn't it?" Jonas looked up from the fire to find her watching him with eyes that held no pity, only recognition. She understood because she had lost things too, had been forced to leave behind everything that had once defined her existence. "It does," he admitted. "Makes a man wonder what the point of caring about anything is when it can all be taken away so easily. But you saved me," Catherine said softly. "Yesterday, when you could have ridden past, you chose to help a stranger. That suggests you haven't given up caring entirely." Jonas considered her words, unsure how to respond. He had acted on instinct yesterday, driven by something deeper than conscious thought. The idea that such an impulse might represent hope rather than mere habit was both unsettling and oddly comforting. They spent the rest of the morning in quiet companionship, Jonas tending to Ranger, while Catherine explored the cabin with the careful curiosity of someone learning to feel safe again. He watched her discover his small collection of books, saw her fingers trace the worn spines with something approaching reverence. "You read?" he asked, finding her absorbed in a volume of poetry. "I was a schoolteacher before I married," Catherine replied, and there was wistfulness in her voice, for the woman she had been before Thaddeus Morrison reshaped her into something fearful and broken. "I loved books, loved learning." Thaddeus considered such interests frivolous for a wife. The casual mention of her husband's control over even her intellectual life sparked something dark and angry in Jonas's chest. He had seen men try to break other men in war, had witnessed cruelty that defied understanding. But there was something particularly repugnant about the systematic destruction of someone's spirit through intimate violence. "You can read anything you like here," he said quietly. Catherine looked up at him with surprise, as if the concept of choosing her own books was still strange to her. Then she smiled, the first genuine smile he had seen from her, and Jonas felt something in his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Outside, the afternoon sun began to break through the clouds, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and silver. It was beautiful and peaceful, but Jonas found himself watching the tree line with new wariness, wondering how long their sanctuary would remain undiscovered. 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt both natural and strange to Jonas. Catherine's presence had transformed the cabin from a solitary refuge into something that almost resembled a home. She moved through the space with increasing confidence, learning where he kept things, anticipating his needs, contributing her own touches that softened the stark functionality he had cultivated over years of bachelor existence. It was on the 4th morning that she made the discovery that would change everything between them. Jonas had gone to tend Ranger and check his snares, leaving Catherine alone in the cabin for the first time since her arrival. When he returned an hour later, he found her sitting at his small table, holding something in her hands that made his blood run cold. The Medal of Honor lay in her palm like an accusation, its bronze surface catching the morning light. Beside it on the table lay the small wooden box where he had kept it hidden, along with his discharge papers and a handful of letters he had never been able to bring himself to destroy. "I'm sorry," Catherine said immediately, seeing his expression. "I was looking for something to mend this tear in my dress, and I found your sewing kit in the box." "I didn't mean to pry." Jonas stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the medal that represented both the highest honor his country could bestow and the deepest shame he carried. He hadn't looked at it in years, had buried it away with all the other reminders of the man he used to be. "Lieutenant Jonas Whitmore," Catherine read softly from the citation. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty during the Battle of Chancellorsville." She looked up at him with new understanding in her grey-blue eyes. "You were a hero." "I was a survivor," Jonas replied harshly, moving into the cabin and closing the door with more force than necessary. "Heroes don't come home when better men don't." Catherine carefully placed the medal back in its box, her movements gentle and respectful. "Tell me what happened." Jonas wanted to refuse, wanted to lock the memories away where they belonged, but something in her voice, a quality of genuine interest rather than morbid curiosity, made him pause. He sat down across from her, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. "Chancellorsville was a mess from start to finish," he began, the words coming slowly at first, then with increasing momentum as the long-held dam finally burst. "We were supposed to be advancing on Lee's position, but everything went wrong. Communications broke down, units got separated, and before we knew it, we were surrounded by Confederate forces in dense woods where you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction." Catherine listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving his face as he described the chaos of battle, the screams of wounded men, The impossible decisions that war demanded of those who survived its crucible. I had 60 men under my command when we went in, Jonas continued. Farm boys mostly, kids who'd never been more than 20 miles from home. By the end of the day, I brought 12 of them out alive. The citation says you saved an entire company, Catherine said softly. Jonas laughed bitterly. The citation says a lot of things. It doesn't say that I had to choose which wounded men to leave behind because we couldn't carry them all. It doesn't say that some of those boys called for their mothers while they died, or that I lied to them about how bad their injuries were so they wouldn't be afraid. Catherine reached across the table and covered his hands with hers, her touch warm and steady. It also doesn't say that you carried those 12 men to safety when a lesser man would have saved only himself. The simple compassion in her voice nearly undid him. Jonas felt tears threaten for the first time in years, emotions he had thought safely buried rising to the surface like floodwater breaching a levee. I dream about them sometimes, he admitted. The ones I left behind. They ask me why I got to live when they didn't, and I never have a good answer. Perhaps the answer isn't one you're meant to give them, Catherine said gently. Perhaps it's one you're meant to live. Jonas looked up at her, struck by the wisdom in her words. There was something in her eyes that spoke of her own hard-won understanding of survival's burden, the weight that came with enduring when others did not. Your husband, he said suddenly, understanding flooding through him. He wasn't the first man to hurt you, was he? Catherine's hand stilled on his, and for a moment he thought he had overstepped. Then she nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. My father was a hard man, she said. He believed that breaking a woman's spirit was necessary to make her properly submissive. When Thaddeus came courting with his fine manners and gentle words, I hoped that I had found someone different. But he wasn't. He was worse. Catherine replied simply. My father's cruelty was honest, straightforward. Thaddeus's was calculated, designed to keep me constantly off balance, never knowing when kindness might turn to violence. Jonas turned his hands palm up beneath hers, capturing her fingers in a gentle grip. I'm sorry, he said. No one should have to endure that. We both carry wounds that never quite heal, don't we? Catherine observed. Perhaps that's why. She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. Why what? Why I feel safe with you, she finished quietly. Why being here feels more like home than anywhere I've lived in years. The admission hung between them, like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Jonas felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of bonds he had thought permanent. For the first time in 15 years, the idea of caring for someone, of allowing someone to care for him, didn't seem like an invitation to inevitable loss. They sat in silence for several minutes. Hands joined across the table, each lost in thoughts that were both deeply personal and somehow shared. Outside, snow began to fall again, but instead of feeling trapped, Jonas found himself grateful for the enforced isolation that kept the world at bay. There's something else, Catherine said eventually, and the hesitation in her voice made him look up. Something I found in your box. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small object that Jonas recognized with a painful start. It was a wooden cross, no bigger than his thumb, carved with painstaking care from a piece of pine. The wood was smooth from years of handling, and the simple design spoke of love and hope and infinite tenderness. You made this, Catherine said. It wasn't a question. Jonas nodded, unable to speak. He had carved that cross during the long winter after he'd learned of his family's death, had worked on it by firelight with hands that shook from grief and whiskey. It was meant to mark his daughter's grave, but he had never been able to bring himself to place it there. Mary was her name? Catherine asked gently. Mary Elizabeth, Jonas whispered. She would have been 23 this year, probably married with children of her own. Catherine turned the cross over in her palm, studying the careful craftsmanship with an artist's eye. She would have been proud to have a father who loved her enough to create something so beautiful in her memory. I never put it on her grave, Jonas confessed. Every time I tried, I couldn't make it final. Catherine stood and moved around the table to him, placing the cross gently in his hands. "Perhaps it was never meant for her grave," she said softly. "Perhaps it was meant to stay with you, to remind you that love doesn't end with death." As her words washed over him, Jonas felt something break open inside his chest, not the sharp crack of fresh pain, but the slow healing break of ice beginning to thaw. For the first time since he'd carved it, the little cross felt like a blessing rather than a burden. The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Catherine's strength returned gradually, color blooming in her cheeks as regular meals and peaceful sleep worked their healing magic. Jonas found himself looking forward to each morning's first glimpse of her face, to the sound of her voice calling his name, to the 100 small ways she had begun to make the cabin feel alive. They had settled into an easy domesticity that surprised them both. Catherine proved herself capable in ways that went far beyond what Jonas had expected from a woman of her apparent refinement. She could cook over an open fire, mend clothing with neat, precise stitches, and even help with some of the outdoor chores when the weather permitted. Her hands, soft when she'd first arrived, began to show the honest calluses of useful work. "You never learned these skills in a judge's house," Jonas observed one morning as he watched her expertly skin a rabbit he had snared. Catherine smiled, her knife moving with practiced efficiency. "My mother died when I was 12, she explained. "Before I married Thaddeus, I kept house for my father and 2 younger brothers. A woman learns to be practical quickly when she's responsible for feeding a family. What happened to your brothers?" A shadow crossed Catherine's face, and her hands stilled for a moment. "James joined the cavalry and died at Bull Run. Thomas went west to try his luck in the California goldfields. I haven't heard from him in 3 years. Jonas heard the carefully controlled pain in her voice and understood. Catherine had lost her family piece by piece, just as he had, until marriage to Thaddeus Morrison had represented not love, but the simple human need to belong somewhere, to someone. "Do you miss them?" he asked gently. "Every day," Catherine replied. "James was so young, barely 18 when he enlisted. He used to say he was going to come home a hero and buy us all a big house in San Francisco." She resumed her work, but Jonas could see the tears she was holding back. Thomas was the dreamer of the family. He believed in possibilities, in the idea that a man could remake himself if he just had the courage to try. Jonas found himself thinking of his own lost family, of dreams interrupted and hopes buried beneath the weight of circumstance. Maybe he did remake himself, he suggested. Maybe he found what he was looking for out there. Catherine looked up at him with a smile that was equal parts gratitude and sorrow. "I hope so. I'd like to think that somewhere in California, Thomas is living the life he dreamed of, with a wife who loves him and children who think he's the finest man in the world." They worked together in comfortable silence after that, Jonas preparing firewood while Catherine finished with the rabbit. There was something deeply satisfying about these shared tasks, a sense of partnership that neither had experienced in longer than they cared to remember. It was during one of these peaceful mornings that Catherine made an observation that would prove to be prophetic. "Spring is coming," she said, looking out the window at the subtle changes in light that spoke of winter's gradual retreat. "The snow is beginning to melt in the lower elevations." Jonas followed her gaze, noting the way the icicles hanging from the eaves had begun to drip steadily, the sound like a clock marking time's passage. Spring meant that the passes would open, that travel would become possible again, that the world beyond their mountain sanctuary would reassert its claims upon them both. "Are you anxious to leave?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the sudden tightness in his chest. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the distant peaks that had become as familiar to her as the walls of the cabin. "I should be," she said finally. "A month ago, all I wanted was to put as much distance as possible between myself and my past. But now—" She stopped, color rising in her cheeks, and Jonas felt his heart skip a beat at the implications of her unfinished sentence. "Now," he prompted gently, Catherine turned to face him, and in her grey-blue eyes he saw a vulnerability that took his breath away. "Now I find myself wishing that spring would never come, that we could stay like this forever, safe from everything and everyone who might want to hurt us." The admission hung between them like a confession, weighted with meaning that neither was quite ready to fully acknowledge. Jonas felt something shift inside him, a recognition that what he had thought was simple compassion for a woman in distress had deepened into something far more complex and dangerous. "Catherine," he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I know what you're going to say," she said quietly. "That I'm confused, that I'm conflating gratitude with deeper feelings, that I don't know my own mind. Thaddeus used to say things like that when he wanted to dismiss something I felt or thought." Jonas shook his head, moving closer to where she stood by the window. "I was going to say that I understand exactly what you mean, because I've been thinking the same thing." The surprise that flickered across Catherine's features was quickly replaced by something that might have been hope.
"You have?"
"Every morning when I wake up and hear you moving around the cabin, I think about how empty this place felt before you came," Jonas admitted. "Every evening when we sit by the fire and talk, I remember what it was like to go days without hearing another human voice. You've given me something I didn't even realize I was missing." Catherine stepped closer to him, and Jonas could see the rapid pulse at her throat, could smell the faint scent of wildflowers that she had begun pressing between the pages of his books. She had started that habit a week ago, creating small bouquets from the alpine flowers that bloomed in sheltered spots despite the snow, preserving their beauty in a way that spoke of hope for the future. "What are we doing, Jonas?" she asked softly. "What is this between us?" Jonas reached out and gently touched her cheek, marveling at the softness of her skin beneath his work-roughened fingers. "I don't know," he said honestly. "All I know is that for the first time in 15 years, I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living." Catherine leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly as if savoring the simple contact. When she opened them again, Jonas saw his own confused longing reflected there, along with something else, a determination that reminded him of the courage that had carried her through the wilderness to his door. "Then perhaps we should stop worrying about what it means and simply be grateful for what it is," she said. Before Jonas could respond, Catherine rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was gentle and hesitant and utterly transformative. For a moment the world narrowed to the warmth of her mouth, the softness of her body against his, the miracle of connection after so many years of solitude. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Jonas could see tears glistening in Catherine's eyes. "I never thought I would feel safe enough to do that again," she whispered. Jonas gathered her into his arms, holding her close as the morning sun streamed through the window and painted them both in golden light. Outside, he could hear the steady drip of melting snow, the sound of winter's retreat and spring's inevitable approach. But for this moment, this perfect, fragile moment, time seemed suspended, and the future was a distant concern that could not touch the sanctuary they had built together. The kiss changed everything, and nothing at all. In the days that followed, Jonas and Catherine moved around each other with a new awareness, as if the very air between them had become charged with possibility. Yet they maintained the careful courtesy that had developed over their weeks together, neither quite ready to explore the full implications of what had passed between them. It was Catherine who finally broke the delicate tension that had settled over the cabin like morning mist. She was sitting by the fire in the evening, mending one of Jonas's shirts when she spoke without looking up from her work. "You know, before I met Thaddeus, I thought I understood what love was supposed to feel like." Jonas looked up from the letter he was writing, a quarterly report to the territorial authorities, one of the few connections he maintained with the outside world. "What did you think it felt like?" Catherine's needle paused in its movement through the fabric. "Overwhelming," she said quietly. "I thought it should sweep you away, make you lose yourself completely in another person. I thought that giving up everything for someone was the highest expression of devotion. And now Now I think that was the philosophy of a girl who had never known what it meant to truly value herself, Catherine replied, finally looking up to meet his eyes. Real love, the kind worth having, doesn't diminish you. It makes you more yourself than you ever thought possible. Jonas felt something catch in his throat at the simple wisdom of her words. Is that what this is? He asked gently. What's growing between us? Catherine set down her mending and moved to sit closer to him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her grey-blue eyes. I don't know yet, she admitted. But I know that when I'm with you, I remember who I used to be before I learned to make myself small and quiet and convenient. I remember that I once had opinions about books and politics and the best way to train a horse. I remember that I once believed my thoughts mattered. Jonas reached out and took her hand, noting how it fit perfectly in his own. They do matter. You matter. Do you know what Thaddeus used to say when I expressed an opinion he disagreed with? Catherine's voice was steady, but Jonas could hear the old pain beneath it. He would smile and pat my hand and say, Now, Catherine, we both know you don't really think that. You're just repeating something you heard somewhere without understanding it properly. The casual cruelty of it made Jonas's jaw clench with anger. He was wrong, yes he was. But after 3 years of hearing it, I began to doubt myself. I began to think that perhaps he was right, that my thoughts were just echoes of other people's ideas, that I had no real substance of my own. Catherine pulled her hand free and stood, moving to the small shelf where Jonas kept his books. She ran her fingers along the spines with the reverent touch he had come to associate with her love of learning. These past weeks, reading again, talking with you about everything from philosophy to the best way to preserve venison for winter, I've remembered that I do have a mind worth respecting. You listen when I speak. You ask my opinion and wait for the answer as if it matters to you. It does matter, Jonas said, rising to join her by the bookshelf. Everything about you matters. Catherine turned to face him, and in the firelight he could see tears glistening in her eyes. That's what I'm afraid of, she whispered. What do you mean? I'm afraid that I matter too much to you already, Catherine said, her voice barely audible. I'm afraid that when spring comes and I have to leave, it will break something in both of us that can't be repaired. Jonas felt his heart constrict at the pain in her voice. Who says you have to leave? Be realistic, Jonas. I can't stay here forever, hiding from the world. Eventually someone will come looking for me, and when they do, I won't let you be hurt because of my presence. Let me worry about that, Jonas said firmly. I've been taking care of myself in these mountains for 15 years. I'm not helpless. Catherine reached up and touched his cheek with trembling fingers. I know you're not helpless, but Thaddeus is dangerous in ways you don't understand. He has money, influence, connections throughout the territory. If he discovers that you've been sheltering me, then we'll deal with it when it happens, Jonas interrupted. Together, the word hung between them, freighted with promise and possibility. Catherine stared up at him, and Jonas could see the war being fought behind her eyes, hope battling against hard-learned caution. The desire to believe in a future, struggling against the certainty that good things never lasted. I found something today, she said suddenly, reaching into her pocket. When I was cleaning out the cabinet by the kitchen, she withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft at the creases. Jonas recognized it immediately, and his stomach clenched with a mixture of grief and embarrassment. You weren't meant to find that, he said quietly. Catherine unfolded the letter carefully, handling it with the same reverence she showed his books. It's beautiful, she said softly, and heartbreaking. Jonas remembered writing that letter in the depths of his first winter in the mountains, when grief had been a living thing clawing at his insides and whiskey had been his only companion. It was addressed to Sarah, his dead wife, full of apologies and regrets, and the desperate longing of a man who couldn't accept that some losses could never be undone. I was drunk when I wrote it, Jonas said, his voice rough with old shame, drunk and half mad with grief. I kept it because he stopped, unable to explain the compulsion that had made him preserve that artifact of his darkest hour, because it was the last conversation you could have with her, Catherine finished gently, because putting words on paper made her feel real again, even for a little while. Jonas looked at her in amazement, struck once again by her ability to understand the deepest truths of his experience. "Yes," he said simply. Catherine refolded the letter with careful precision and held it out to him. "I think you should burn it." "What?" "Not because it isn't beautiful, and not because your love for Sarah wasn't real and important," Catherine explained, "but because holding on to it is holding you in a place where love means only loss, where caring for someone is just a prelude to grief." Jonas stared at the letter in her outstretched hand, feeling as if she were asking him to burn a piece of his own heart. "I don't know if I can." "Then let me help you," Catherine said softly. "Let me help you say goodbye to the past so that we can both have a future." The offer hung between them, like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Jonas looked into Catherine's eyes and saw not a demand, but an invitation. Not an ultimatum, but a gift. She was offering to help him carry a burden that had grown too heavy for one person to bear alone. Slowly, with hands that trembled only slightly, Jonas took the letter from her fingers. Together, they moved to the fireplace, where the flames danced and crackled with cheerful warmth. For a moment, Jonas hesitated, the letter poised above the fire like a prayer waiting to be released. "Will you say something?" he asked quietly. "Something to make this feel less like betrayal?" Catherine stepped closer to him, her shoulder touching his as they stood before the fire. "Sarah loved you enough to want your happiness," she said simply. "Holding on to grief isn't honoring her memory, it's denying the gift she gave you by loving you at all." With a deep breath that felt like absolution, Jonas released the letter into the flames. They watched together as the paper caught and flared, years of carefully preserved sorrow transformed into light and heat and ash. When the last fragment had burned away, Jonas felt something in his chest unlock, a tightness he had carried for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. "Thank you," he whispered, and meant it more deeply than any words he had ever spoken. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday morning when the snow was melting fast enough to create small streams that sang their way down the mountainside. Jonas was splitting wood behind the cabin when Ranger's warning whinny made him look up sharply. Through the trees, he could see a lone rider picking his way carefully up the trail, his horse moving with the deliberate caution of an animal navigating treacherous footing. Jonas set down his axe and moved quickly to the front of the cabin, his hand instinctively checking the position of the rifle he kept mounted by the door. Inside, he could hear Catherine humming softly as she prepared their midday meal, blissfully unaware that their sanctuary was about to be invaded. The rider was a young man, perhaps 25, with the lean build and careful eyes of someone accustomed to trouble. He wore traveling clothes that had seen hard use, and the gun at his hip was positioned for quick access rather than show. When he spotted Jonas waiting on the porch, he raised one hand in the universal gesture of peaceful approach. But Jonas noticed that his other hand remained close to his weapon. "Morning," the stranger called out as he drew nearer. "Name's Billy Crenshaw. I'm looking for someone, and I'm hoping you might be able to help me." Jonas stepped down from the porch, positioning himself between the stranger and the cabin door. "Don't get many visitors up here," he said carefully. "Who might you be looking for?" Billy dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post Jonas had built years ago, but rarely used. Up close, Jonas could see that the young man's face bore the kind of premature hardness that came from making difficult choices for money. "I'm tracking a woman," Billy said, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "About 25, dark hair, pretty, might be traveling alone, might be with someone. Her husband's offering a substantial reward for information about her whereabouts." Jonas felt ice form in his stomach as Billy unfolded what appeared to be a wanted poster. Even upside down, he could see that it bore a reasonably accurate sketch of Catherine's face, along with text he couldn't read from his current position. "What's this woman supposed to have done?" Jonas asked, fighting to keep his voice level. Billy's smile was thin and entirely without warmth. "Theft, mostly. Took some valuable items when she ran off. Her husband's real anxious to get them back, along with his property. The casual way Billy referred to Catherine as property made Jonas's hands clench into fists, but he forced himself to remain calm. Haven't seen anyone like that around here. Like I said, we don't get many visitors. Mind if I take a look at that poster more closely? Jonas asked, extending his hand. Just to be sure. Billy hesitated for a moment, then handed over the paper. Jonas unfolded it completely, and what he read there made his blood run cold. The poster identified Catherine as Mrs. Thaddeus Morrison, wife of the Honorable Judge Thaddeus Morrison of the Territorial Court. But that wasn't what chilled him to the bone. At the bottom of the poster, in bold letters, were the words, "Wanted for murder, 500 reward, dead or alive." Jonas read the description twice, his mind reeling. According to the poster, Catherine was wanted for the murder of one James Fletcher, attorney at law, who had been found shot to death in Judge Morrison's home. The poster claimed that Catherine had fled immediately after the killing, taking with her certain documents and valuables belonging to her husband. Like I said, Jonas repeated, handing the poster back with hands that he hoped weren't visibly shaking. Haven't seen anyone like that. Billy studied Jonas's face with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to detecting lies. You sure about that? Because Judge Morrison is offering $500 for information leading to her capture. That's a lot of money for a man living alone in the mountains. It is, Jonas agreed. But I can't give you information I don't have. From inside the cabin came the sound of Catherine's voice, raised in song, a melody Jonas had heard her humming many times over the past weeks. Billy's head turned sharply toward the sound, his hand dropping instinctively to his gun. That your wife? Billy asked casually. Sister, Jonas replied without hesitation. Lost her husband last winter. Came to stay with me while she figures out what to do next. Billy nodded slowly, but Jonas could see that he wasn't entirely convinced. Mind if I water my horse? It's been a long ride up from Riverside. Jonas wanted nothing more than to refuse to order the man off his property immediately. But doing so would only confirm Billy's suspicions. Help yourself, he said instead. Well's around back. As Billy led his horse toward the rear of the cabin, Jonas moved quickly to the door. Catherine appeared immediately, her face bright with curiosity that faded quickly when she saw his expression. What's wrong? She whispered. Jonas grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the window. There's a bounty hunter outside. He has a poster with your picture on it. Catherine's face went white. What does it say? Jonas hesitated, then decided she needed to know the truth. It says you're wanted for murdering someone named James Fletcher. Catherine's knees buckled, and Jonas caught her before she could fall. Oh, God, she whispered. They're saying I killed James? You knew him. He was the lawyer I told you about, Catherine said, her voice barely audible. The one who discovered Thaddeus's illegal dealings. He came to our house that night to confront my husband about what he'd found. I was hiding in the pantry when Thaddeus shot him. Jonas felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Your husband killed Fletcher, then blamed it on you when you disappeared. Of course he did, Catherine said bitterly. It explains everything perfectly. The unfaithful wife who murdered her husband's business associate in a fit of jealous rage, then fled with stolen documents and valuables. Who would question such a story, especially coming from a respected judge? The sound of footsteps on the porch made them both freeze. Billy was returning from watering his horse, and Jonas could hear him moving slowly, deliberately, like a man who had already made up his mind about something. Hide, Jonas whispered urgently. The bedroom. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Catherine looked at him with terror in her eyes. What are you going to do? Whatever I have to, Jonas replied grimly. Catherine disappeared into the bedroom just as Billy knocked on the cabin door. Jonas took a deep breath, checked his rifle one more time, and opened the door with what he hoped was a casual expression. Find what you were looking for? Jonas asked. Billy stood on the porch with his hand resting openly on his gun butt. His earlier pretense of friendliness had evaporated, replaced by the cold professionalism of a man conducting business. Funny thing, Billy said conversationally. I was talking to the folks down in Riverside before I came up here. Seems a man matching your description bought supplies for 2 people about 6 weeks ago. Bought women's clothes, too. Now, why would a man living alone need women's clothes? Jonas felt sweat bead on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. Like I told you, my sister's been staying with me. Yeah, about that, Billy continued. Funny thing is, the storekeeper in Riverside knew you by sight. Said you'd been coming down there for supplies for years, always alone, never mentioned any family. In fact, he seemed real surprised when I told him you had a sister visiting. The game was up, and they both knew it. Jonas could see the satisfied gleam in Billy's eyes, the confidence of a hunter who had successfully cornered his prey. But Billy had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. "Where is she?" Billy asked, his gun sliding from its holster with practiced ease. Jonas smiled grimly, remembering lessons learned in a dozen battlefields about the importance of controlling the initiative. "She's right behind you." Billy spun around instinctively, and in that moment of distraction, Jonas moved. His hand closed around the rifle by the door, bringing it up and around in one fluid motion. By the time Billy realized he had been tricked, Jonas had the muzzle pressed against the bounty hunter's spine. "Drop the gun," Jonas said quietly. Billy hesitated for a moment, calculating odds and distances. Then he sighed and let his pistol fall to the porch with a metallic clatter. "You're making a mistake," Billy said. "That woman's wanted for murder. You're harboring a dangerous criminal." "The only dangerous criminal I see," Jonas replied, "is the man who came to my home with lies and threats, hunting an innocent woman for blood money." From inside the cabin, Catherine appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. In her hands, she held the blood-stained wedding ring she had hidden away weeks ago, and beside it, a small bundle of papers Jonas had never seen before. "He's not entirely wrong," Catherine said quietly. "I am dangerous to certain people who have been using Judge Morrison's court to hide their crimes. James Fletcher died because he discovered evidence of corruption that goes all the way to the territorial capital. And I have proof of everything." Jonas kept the rifle trained on Billy, while Catherine explained the true nature of the documents she had been carrying all these weeks. The papers, she revealed, detailed a complex web of corruption involving Judge Morrison, several prominent businessmen, and a network of officials who had been using the territorial court system to legitimize illegal land grabs and fraudulent mining claims. James Fletcher wasn't just Thaddeus's business associate, Catherine said, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was revealing. He was an investigator sent by the territorial governor to look into reports of judicial misconduct. When he uncovered the extent of the corruption, he came to our house to confront Thaddeus directly. Billy listened with growing unease as the true scope of the situation became clear. "You're talking about some powerful people," he said carefully. "People who don't take kindly to interference, which is exactly why they're so desperate to silence me," Catherine replied. "And why they've put such a high price on my head." Jonas felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach as he realized the full implications of what Catherine was telling him. This isn't just about an abusive husband anymore, is it? This is about a conspiracy that goes to the highest levels of territorial government. Catherine nodded gravely. James Fletcher's investigation was just the beginning. There are federal marshals in Denver who have been building a case against this network for months. These documents are the final piece they need to bring down the entire operation. Then we need to get you to Denver, Jonas said immediately. Billy laughed harshly. "You think it's going to be that simple? Morrison's got men watching every road between here and Colorado. Soon as you show your face in any town of decent size, you'll have 6 guns pointed at you. What do you suggest?" Jonas asked, though he was already beginning to formulate plans of his own. Billy was quiet for a moment, and Jonas could see him weighing options and calculating risks. "There might be a way," he said finally, "but it would require trusting me, and I don't expect that's something you're inclined to do right about now." Jonas studied the bounty hunter's face, looking for signs of deception. "Keep talking. I wasn't entirely honest when I introduced myself," Billy admitted. "My name really is Billy Crenshaw, and I really am a bounty hunter." But I'm also working for the federal marshals in Denver. They sent me to find Mrs. Morrison because they knew Morrison would put a price on her head, and they wanted to reach her before the real bounty hunters did. Catherine stared at him in amazement. You're working for the government? Special deputy appointed directly by Marshal Patterson in Denver, Billy confirmed, reaching slowly into his coat to withdraw a badge. My job was to find you and bring you safely to Denver so you could testify before a federal grand jury. Jonas felt a mixture of relief and suspicion. Why didn't you just say that from the beginning? Billy shrugged. Because I needed to be sure you were really protecting her and not just holding her for the reward money. There are a lot of people who would turn in their own mothers for $500. Catherine moved closer to examine the badge, and Jonas could see hope beginning to war with caution in her expression. How do we know you're telling the truth now? Because, Billy said simply, if I wanted to take you back to Morrison for the reward, I would have come with more men and a lot more firepower. The fact that I came alone should tell you something about my real intentions. Jonas considered this logic and found it sound, but he wasn't ready to lower his guard entirely. Assuming you're telling the truth, what's your plan for getting Catherine to Denver safely? Billy looked around the cabin, taking in its remote location and defensive advantages. Actually, I think the best plan might be to bring Denver to her. What do you mean? Marshal Patterson and his deputies are already in the territory, operating out of a temporary base in Grand Junction. If I can get word to them about Mrs. Morrison's location, they could be here within a week. It would be a lot safer than trying to move her across hostile territory. Catherine shook her head immediately. I won't put Jonas in any more danger than I already have. If federal marshals come here, Morrison's network will know exactly where to find us. She's right, Jonas agreed. This place has been safe because it's secret. The moment government officials start riding up that trail, it becomes a target. Billy nodded thoughtfully. Then we need a different approach. What if we arrange a meeting on neutral ground? Somewhere public enough that Morrison's people can't make a move, but private enough that we can transfer the evidence safely. Jonas found himself thinking like the military strategist he had once been, weighing terrain and tactics and the psychology of their enemies. Where did you have in mind? There's a trading post about 40 miles south of here, run by a man named Samuel Hutchins. He's known for staying neutral in territorial politics, and his place is always busy enough that strangers don't attract attention. If we could arrange to meet the marshals there, it could work, Jonas interrupted, warming to the idea. But we'd need to be very careful about timing and approach. Morrison's people will be watching for exactly this kind of move. Catherine had been listening to their discussion with growing alarm. You're both talking as if this is some kind of military operation. These are people's lives we're discussing, including yours. Jonas, I won't be responsible for getting you killed because of my problems. Jonas turned to face her fully, and in his eyes she saw the steel that had once made him a decorated officer. These aren't your problems anymore, Catherine. They're our problems. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let corrupt officials and hired killers determine how this ends. The intensity in his voice seemed to surprise even him, and Catherine could see him struggling with emotions that went deeper than simple protectiveness. It was Billy who broke the tension by clearing his throat meaningfully. I hate to interrupt, he said, but we've got more immediate concerns than long-term strategy. I wasn't the only one looking for Mrs. Morrison. And I wasn't the only one who tracked her to this area. There are at least 2 other bounty hunters working these mountains, and they're not operating under federal authority. Jonas felt his stomach clench. How close are they? Close enough that we probably have a day, maybe 2, before they narrow down the search to this specific area. After that, Billy shrugged grimly. Catherine sank into a chair, the weight of their situation finally overwhelming her fragile composure. This is never going to end, is it? Even if we manage to get the evidence to the federal marshals, even if they arrest Morrison and his associates, there will always be someone else looking for revenge. Jonas knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his own. They were cold and trembling, and he could see the fear that she'd been holding at bay for weeks, finally threatening to consume her. Look at me, he said gently. waiting until her grey-blue eyes met his own. "Do you remember what you told me about love? About how real love doesn't diminish you, but makes you more yourself than you ever thought possible?" Catherine nodded wordlessly. "Well, that works both ways," Jonas continued. "You've given me back pieces of myself that I thought were lost forever. You've reminded me what it feels like to have something worth fighting for, something worth protecting. I'm not going to let anyone take that away from us." As he spoke, Jonas reached into his pocket and withdrew something that made Catherine's breath catch in her throat. It was his wife's wedding ring, the one he had worn on a chain around his neck for 15 years. The one she had watched him remove after they burned his letter to Sarah. "I should have done this weeks ago," Jonas said quietly, taking Catherine's left hand and sliding the ring onto her finger. "Will you marry me, Catherine Morrison? Will you let me spend whatever time we have left making sure you never have to face the world alone again?" Catherine stared down at the ring, tears streaming down her cheeks. It was a simple gold band, worn smooth by years of faithful wearing, and it fit her finger as if it had been made for her. "Yes," she whispered. And then louder with growing conviction, "Yes, Jonas Whitmore, I will marry you." Billy watched this exchange with growing impatience. "This is all very touching," he said finally, "but we still have the small matter of staying alive long enough for a wedding. If those other bounty hunters are as close as I think they are, we need to move fast." Jonas rose and moved to the window, studying the afternoon light and calculating how much time they had before darkness fell. "How well do you know this country?" he asked Billy. "Well enough to get around, not well enough to disappear." "Then here's what we're going to do," Jonas said, his voice taking on the authority of command. "We're going to use the next few hours to prepare for war, because if Morrison's hired killers want Catherine, they're going to have to go through me to get her. And I can promise you that won't be as easy as they think." Catherine looked up at him with a mixture of admiration and terror. "Jonas, you can't fight them all." "I don't intend to fight them all," Jonas replied grimly. "I intend to fight them smart. These mountains have been my home for 15 years, and I know every trail, every hiding place, every defensive position between here and the nearest town. If those men want a war, I'll give them one they'll never forget." As the sun began to set behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape, 3 people who had been strangers that morning began preparing for a battle that would determine not just their survival, but the future of justice in the entire territory. They came at dawn. Just as Jonas had predicted they would, he had positioned himself in the trees above the cabin, using the elevated position he had scouted years ago as a defensive point. From here, he could see the entire approach trail while remaining hidden among the pine boughs. Billy was stationed at the rear of the cabin, covering the only other route that led to their position. Catherine remained inside, the precious documents secured in a leather pouch that she wore close to her heart. Jonas counted 4 riders, picking their way carefully up the mountain trail. They moved with the calculated caution of professionals, their weapons visible and ready. Through his field glasses, he could see that these were not ordinary bounty hunters. These men had the look of hired killers, the kind who would shoot first and worry about taking prisoners later. The lead rider was a tall man with a graying beard and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He raised his hand to halt his companions when they reached the clearing where Jonas's cabin stood, and Jonas could see him studying the layout with the tactical eye of an experienced soldier. "Whitmore," the man called out, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "We know you're in there, and we know you're harboring a fugitive. Send out Catherine Morrison, and nobody needs to get hurt." Jonas remained silent, waiting to see what their next move would be. He had learned in the war that patience was often the most valuable weapon a defender possessed. "We're not going away, Whitmore," the man continued. "Judge Morrison sent us with specific instructions. The woman comes with us, one way or another." Still, Jonas waited, his rifle trained on the leader, while his eyes tracked the movements of the other 3 men. They were spreading out, trying to surround the cabin, but their unfamiliarity with the terrain was working against them. One had already positioned himself poorly, trapped between two large boulders with no clear line of retreat. It was Catherine who broke the silence, her voice ringing out clear and strong from inside the cabin. "I'm not going anywhere with you. Tell Judge Morrison that his lies won't protect him much longer." The leader smiled grimly and gestured to his men. "Have it your way, lady. Boys, burn them out." That was when Jonas decided the talking was over. His first shot took the leader in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him from his horse. The sound of the rifle echoed off the mountainsides like thunder, and suddenly the peaceful morning erupted into chaos. The other three men scrambled for cover, returning fire in Jonas's general direction, but unable to pinpoint his exact position. Billy's rifle spoke from behind the cabin, and one of the attackers cried out in pain as a bullet found its mark. Jonas had chosen his position well. The trees provided excellent concealment, while giving him clear fields of fire on anyone approaching the cabin. He worked the bolt of his rifle smoothly, each shot carefully aimed and deliberately placed. These men might be professionals, but they were fighting on his ground now, by his rules. "Damn it, where is he?" One of the attackers shouted, clearly frustrated by their inability to locate their primary opponent. "In the trees somewhere," another replied. "We need to flush him out." Jonas smiled grimly at their confusion. Let them waste ammunition shooting at shadows while he picked them off one by one. This was exactly the kind of asymmetric warfare he had excelled at during his military service. The man trapped between the boulders made the mistake of trying to relocate to better cover. Jonas tracked his movement calmly, leading the target just as he had been trained to do 20 years ago. His shot caught the man center mass, dropping him instantly. "We're getting slaughtered up here," the wounded leader called out. "Fall back and regroup." But Jonas had no intention of letting them escape to return with reinforcements. As the surviving attackers tried to retreat down the trail, he moved through the trees like a ghost, using terrain and cover to maintain pressure on them while staying invisible himself. Billy emerged from his position behind the cabin, adding his fire to Jonas's as they drove the remaining men farther down the mountain. Within minutes, what had begun as an assault on the cabin had turned into a rout. When the shooting finally stopped, 2 of the attackers were dead, 1 was badly wounded, and only 1 had managed to escape completely. The leader, clutching his wounded shoulder, found himself staring down the barrels of 2 rifles as Jonas and Billy approached his position. "You made a mistake coming here," Jonas said quietly, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man who had seen too much death to be impressed by hired killers. "This isn't over," the wounded man gasped. "Morrison has more men, more resources. He'll keep sending people until..." "Until what?" Catherine's voice cut through his threats as she emerged from the cabin, the leather pouch containing the evidence clutched tightly in her hands. "Until he silences the only witness to his crimes. Until he destroys the proof of his corruption." She held up the documents, and Jonas could see the fear that flickered across the wounded man's face as he realized what she was holding. "Those papers contain enough evidence to hang your boss and half the territorial government." Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Judge Morrison is finished, and so are all the men who helped him." The wounded leader stared at her with growing desperation, and Jonas could see him calculating one last desperate gamble. The wounded leader's hand moved toward a concealed pistol with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. Jonas saw the movement and reacted instantly, but it was Catherine who surprised them all. She stepped forward deliberately, placing herself between the wounded man and the guns pointed at him. In her hands, she held not just the documents that could destroy Judge Morrison, but something else, a small, leather-bound journal that Jonas had never seen before. "Don't," she said firmly, addressing the wounded man. "Don't throw your life away for a man who would sacrifice you without a second thought." The leader's hand paused, confusion flickering across his pain-contorted features. "What are you talking about?" Catherine opened the journal, revealing pages covered with meticulous handwriting. "This is James Fletcher's investigation log," she said quietly. "Everything he discovered, every crime he uncovered, every name of everyone involved in Morrison's network." including yours, Captain Benjamin Hayes, formerly of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry." The man's face went white as Catherine read his name aloud. Jonas could see recognition dawning in Billy's eyes as well. Hayes was apparently more than just a hired gun. "Fletcher knew about your involvement in the fraudulent mining claims near Central City," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. "He knew about the murdered prospectors, the forged deeds, the partnership with Morrison to legitimize stolen land through his court." Hayes stared at her with growing horror. "How could you possibly know?" "Because I was there when Fletcher confronted my husband," Catherine replied. "I heard everything. Every name, every crime, every detail of how you and Morrison built your empire on murder and theft." Jonas felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Hayes wasn't just Morrison's hired killer. He was a full partner in the conspiracy. "With as much to lose as the judge himself, you have a choice to make." "Captain Hayes," Catherine said, using his military title deliberately, "you can die here, defending a secret that's already been exposed. Or you can surrender and testify against the man who's been using you as his personal executioner." Hayes's hand moved away from his concealed weapon, and Jonas could see the fight going out of him as he realized the hopelessness of his position. "Morrison will have me killed if I testify." "Morrison will have you killed anyway," Billy interjected, speaking for the first time since the shooting had stopped. "Men like him don't leave loose ends. You think he'll let you live after you failed to silence the only witness to his crimes?" The truth of Billy's words seemed to hit Hayes like a physical blow. Jonas could see him recognizing what he should have understood from the beginning, that he had never been Morrison's partner, only his tool, to be discarded when he was no longer useful. "What kind of deal are you offering?" Hayes asked finally, his voice hollow with defeat. "Full immunity in exchange for testimony against Morrison and his network," Billy replied immediately. "The federal marshals want the big fish, not the small ones who are following orders." Hayes was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the blood seeping through his shirt. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a man who had finally accepted the consequences of his choices. "Morrison's expecting a report from me by noon today," he said slowly. "When he doesn't get it, he'll know something went wrong. He has contingency plans, safe houses, escape routes, enough money hidden away to disappear forever." "Where?" Jonas demanded. "There's a mining camp called Silver Creek, about 60 miles north of Denver. Morrison has been funneling money through a bank there for months, preparing for exactly this situation. If he runs, that's where he'll go first." Billy was already moving, checking his horse and weapons with the efficiency of a man preparing for urgent travel. "How long do we have?" Hayes calculated quickly. "If he doesn't hear from me by nightfall, he'll assume the worst and start running. You might have 12 hours, maybe less." Catherine looked between Jonas and Billy, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You're going after him." "We have to," Jonas replied. "As long as Morrison is free, you'll never be safe. This ends now one way or another." Catherine shook her head immediately. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not," Jonas said firmly. "It's too dangerous." "Those documents are my responsibility," Catherine replied with equal firmness. "The federal marshals need to hear my testimony directly, and I won't hide in the mountains while you and Billy risk your lives to finish what I started." Jonas wanted to argue, but he could see the determination in Catherine's eyes, the same courage that had carried her through the wilderness to his door weeks ago. She had been running from her problems for too long, and now she was ready to face them head on. "Then we all go together," he said finally. "But we do this smart, and we do it by my rules." As they prepared for what might be their final journey together, Jonas felt the weight of his father's hunting knife at his side, the weapon that had been passed down through 3 generations of Whitmore men, each of whom had used it to protect what mattered most to them. Today, it would serve that purpose once again. 6 months later, Jonas stood on the porch of his cabin, watching Catherine tend the small garden she had planted in the clearing behind their home. The federal marshals had arrested Judge Morrison and 17 members of his corruption network, thanks to Catherine's testimony and the evidence she had preserved through those terrifying weeks of flight. The trial had been swift and decisive. Morrison would spend the rest of his life in territorial prison, and several of his associates had met even harsher fates. Captain Hayes had honored his agreement, providing testimony that sealed the cases against the remaining conspirators. In exchange for his cooperation, he had received a reduced sentence and the chance to start over somewhere far from Colorado. Jonas suspected that the former cavalry officer's conscience would prove a harsher punishment than any court could devise. Catherine looked up from her vegetables and waved, her face bright with the kind of contentment Jonas had never thought he would see again. The bruises had long since faded, but more importantly, the wariness in her eyes had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like joy. "The tomatoes are coming along nicely," she called out. "We should have enough for canning before the first frost." Jonas smiled at the domestic normality of the observation. After months of violence and uncertainty, the simple pleasure of planning for winter preserves felt like a miracle. He walked over to join her in the garden, noting how the mountain sun had brought out golden highlights in her dark hair and given her skin a healthy glow that spoke of peace and security. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said formally, taking her hand and bowing slightly over it, "you look particularly beautiful this morning." Catherine laughed at his old-fashioned courtesy, a sound that never failed to make Jonas feel as if the world had suddenly become a brighter place. "Why, thank you, Mr. Whitmore. You're quite handsome yourself." They had been married by a circuit preacher 3 weeks after Morrison's arrest, in a simple ceremony attended by Billy Crenshaw and half the population of Riverside. It had been Catherine's idea to keep her new husband's name rather than reclaim her maiden name. She wanted no connection, however distant, to the life she had left behind. "I received a letter from Billy yesterday," Jonas said, pulling the folded paper from his shirt pocket. "He's been promoted to Chief Deputy Marshal for the Western District. Apparently, his work on the Morrison case impressed some important people in Washington." "I'm glad," Catherine said sincerely. "He risked his life to help us." "He deserves whatever recognition he receives," Jonas nodded, remembering the young man who had arrived at their cabin as a potential threat and left as a trusted friend. Billy had stopped by several times since the trial, always welcome at their table and always full of stories about his continuing adventures in law enforcement. "He also mentioned something else," Jonas continued, his voice carrying a note of barely suppressed excitement. "The territorial governor is creating a new position, Superintendent of Mountain Security, responsible for monitoring remote areas and protecting settlers from bandits and claim jumpers. Billy recommended me for the job." Catherine's eyes widened with interest. "Would you want to do something like that?" Jonas considered the question carefully. For 15 years, his only ambition had been to avoid human contact and the complications it brought. But Catherine had changed everything, had reminded him that isolation was not the same as peace, and that some responsibilities were worth accepting. "I think I might," he admitted. "It would mean traveling more, being away from the cabin for days at a time. But it would also mean using my experience to help people who can't protect themselves." Catherine stepped closer to him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. "Then you should take it," she said simply. "This territory needs men like you, men who understand the difference between justice and revenge, between necessary force and mindless violence." Jonas covered her hands with his own, marveling once again at how perfectly they fit together. "What about you? Are you ready to be married to a lawman?" "I'm ready to be married to you," Catherine replied, rising on her tiptoes to kiss him softly. "Whatever that means, wherever it takes us." As they stood together in their garden, surrounded by the peaceful beauty of the mountains that had sheltered them both, Jonas felt a sense of completion that he had never expected to experience again. The ghosts of his past had not disappeared entirely, but they had been joined by new hopes and possibilities that made their presence bearable. Catherine had blossomed in the months since Morrison's defeat. rediscovering parts of herself that had been buried under years of fear and subjugation. She had begun teaching the children in Riverside 3 days a week, riding down from the mountains with the confidence of a woman who knew her own worth. The shy, desperate creature who had stumbled from the woods that snowy day had been transformed into someone strong and sure and infinitely precious. "There's something else I need to tell you," Catherine said, her voice suddenly shy. Jonas looked down at her, noting the flush in her cheeks and the nervous excitement in her eyes. "What is it?" Catherine took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. I'm fairly certain that we're going to have a baby." Jonas felt the world stop spinning for a moment as the implications of her words sank in. A baby, a child who would grow up knowing only love and safety, who would never doubt that he or she was wanted and cherished. "Are you sure?" he whispered. "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor," Catherine replied. "Are you happy about it?" Jonas swept her into his arms, spinning her around in the middle of their garden while she laughed with delight. When he finally set her down, both were breathless and grinning like children. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Jonas said, his voice thick with emotion. Grateful, amazed, terrified, overwhelmed, but happy most of all, as they stood together planning for the future they would build together. The simple gold rings they wore caught the morning sunlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes that seemed to proclaim their joy to the mountains themselves. They had both learned that love was not just about finding someone to share your life with. It was about becoming someone worthy of being loved in return. And in that knowledge, they had found not just happiness but home.